An issue that's very important to understand as we look at the idea of inheriting one class from another is that in Java, constructors are not inherited. Each class is responsible for defining its own constructors. A derived class, though, must always call one of the base class constructors. So as you define the constructors inside of your derived class, there's always going to be a call back to a base class constructor. Now that call does not have to be explicit. If you don't have an explicit call to a base class constructor, then it will use the base class's no argument constructor. But you can call a specific constructor if you want to. You simply use the super notation followed by the list of parameters that correspond to the base class constructor that you want to call. You do have to make that the first line in your constructor though. Let's see what this looks like in code. Now we've looked at our flight class. We've done a bunch of work with that until now. And I want to focus in on the no argument constructor and its constructor that accepts a flight number. Right? And that allows us to create code that creates an instance of a flight, in this case creating a new flight with flight number 175. Now our cargo flight class that has a number of members inside of it has no constructors defined. That of course means that we can create an instance of cargo flight using a no argument constructor because Java provides a no argument constructor for us by default if we haven't specified one. But if we try to go off and create a cargo flight with a flight number, that's not going to work. Right? We get an error. Because even though our base class flight has a constructor that accepts a flight number, cargo flight does not. So if we want to be able to create cargo flights with a flight number, we need to define a constructor in cargo flight that accepts the flight number. Now we don't have to do that work ourselves. As we said, we can delegate that to the base class by simply using that super notation and passing in flight number. And so now we can go ahead and construct a cargo flight with a flight number, in this case of 294. That calls into our cargo flights constructor accepting a flight number, which in turn calls the implementation inside of flight. Now we can of course extend behavior beyond the base class constructors. For example, our cargo flight class keeps track of the idea of the maximum cargo space. So we could go off and define a cargo flight constructor that accepts flight number and a value that we want to use for max cargo space. Now inside of the cargo flight constructor, we can of course set max cargo space. If we want to go ahead and call up though to the base class constructor, we again use the super notation, but it has to be the first line of the constructor. So this would call into the flight constructor that accepts a flight number and then set max cargo space. But in this situation, rather than call into the base class, we've already done work inside of our class to create a constructor that accepts a flight number. So rather than call super in this case, it would be better to go ahead and use this. So now if we go off and create code that says I want to create a cargo flight instance that accepts a flight number and max cargo space, it'll call our cargo flight constructor that accepts those two parameters. We'll then call up to our cargo flight constructor that accepts the flight number, and then that calls into the base class constructor that accepts flight number. Now something that's happened is that as we've added these two constructors to cargo flight, we've broken a line of code. Right? The line of code where we created the cargo flight passing in no parameters no longer works. If we want to have that, we need to go ahead and add that to our cargo flight class. So now this code would build again, and when we call into our cargo flight constructor, it will then call into our flight class's constructor that takes no arguments. Right? And that happens because we did not specify any base class constructor. Right? So let's say we add another constructor to our cargo flight. This one accepts only cargo space. And all we do inside of here is set max cargo space. So we now create a line of code that news up a cargo flight, passing in only max cargo space. What does this do? Well, it calls our constructor, but before it executes the body of our constructor, it will call up to the flight class's constructor that has no arguments, and then run the rest of our constructor. Right? So it always calls into a base class constructor, even when we don't specify one.